Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. David Kiger. I'm the theological librarian at Emmanuel Christian Seminary. And today we have with us Dr. Daniel Silliman, who is an editor for Christianity Today, an author, a church historian of American history, and an all-around great guy. He keeps bees, he does woodworking, and he has a cat named Heidegger. All things important to know. We're here today because Daniel has recently published a book called Reading Evangelicals, How Christian Fiction Shaped a Culture and a Faith. And Daniel's going to talk to us about his book for a few minutes, and then I'm going to interview him with some questions, and then after my questions, we'll open the questions up to the crowd. We're so grateful you're here with us, and we just look forward to our time together. Daniel, thanks for being here, and I think the first thing we'll have you do is just tell us about your book.
Thanks you guys for being here. This is really nice. I was fully prepared just to sit here and talk to Dave, so it's nice. It's nice that you guys are here too. Maybe the way to start is to tell you how I started the book, where the sort of question started for me. There are really kind of two starting places to the project. One was literally physically in the Christian bookstore. This was an experience I had as a teenager first, where you're sort of walking into a Christian bookstore, and I was trying to figure out, not that I would have announced that this is my reason going to the Christian bookstore, but I was trying to figure out how my own peculiar religious childhood fit into the landscape of other people's Christianity, and how did different parts of Christianity and evangelicalism in particular relate to each other. You know, you drive around town and you see a Nazarene church, a Pentecostal church, and a Baptist church, and you're like, they kind of are related, but like I don't quite know what's going on. How are they connected? And the bookstore really appealed to me as a teenager as a place that kind of embodied some answers, a place that you could kind of just through an experience of the space start to figure some of these things out. So when I became a religious historian studying evangelicalism, I was always a little surprised that no one ever attended to these kinds of spaces. There are actually very few physical spaces in American religious history. If you note, it's very rare that someone like actually talks about, and they were in a church, and the church was like this, and this was the experience of this physical space. And bookstores almost never come up. Maybe they'll say, there were bookstores, but that's it. So I really wanted to think about, what does the bookstore do, and how can the bookstore help answer some broader questions that we have? And then second, the second starting place for me was that I was in grad school, and I was in my first actually evangelical history class, which ended up being my specialization. I didn't know at that point it would be a specialization. And I was asked to give a presentation on Left Behind. And so I did. I gave a 30-minute presentation on Left Behind, and I only talked about the theology. I just explained what's the deal with the rapture, what are dispensations, what's the theology behind this fiction. And my professor, who became my doctoral supervisor and a good friend, asked me at the end, and it was almost like a throwaway question, right? We were basically done, but he asked me, but why is it fiction? Right? They could have written a theology book. They could have written a tract. They could have written a political book. I know there's some politics in here, but it's a novel. So what's that about? Why is it important that it's a novel? How do people engage novels about theology different than they engage theology? Why is this an important book as a work of fiction, as a fictive engagement? And my answer was, I have no idea. But that seems important, right? It seems significant that so much of this literature is fiction, that so much of this stuff that occupies the Christian bookstore is fiction. And so those were kind of the two ideas. And I ended up writing a history of American evangelicalism using the bookstore and novels. And so using both physical spaces and the infrastructure of a conversation that holds people together, and the novels that really speak to imagination and that aren't propositions that people can agree with or disagree with. They're not arguments. They're rather invitations to suspend disbelief and to imagine the world a certain way and to experience life through another character in a particular way. And I ended up finding that if you do that, you can tell the history of American evangelicalism in a way that not just covers it, it's not just that you get from point A to point B, but doing that actually meant covering it in a more diverse way, covering the multiplicities of it, covering some of the parts that don't fit actually neatly well together, start to see how they hang together through the physical infrastructure of book markets and the imagination of novels.
Wonderful. Thanks for that kind of opening of the setting for your book. I appreciated how you bookended the book with your first visit into a bookstore, and then at the end, coming back to it after all of this. Related to evangelicals, in the book, you suggest that kind of the typical propositional way of defining evangelicals by what they believe is problematic. And you turn to Jürgen Habermas, and I think not so overtly, but maybe covertly, to Charles Taylor as a way to kind of reimagine how to define evangelicals. Can you describe a little bit of that for us?
Yeah, the Habermas is really important to me, which if you're not familiar with him, he is a German scholar who talks about the public sphere, the rise in modern Europe of a public and a public sphere, and sort of a conversation that actually transcended local communities and ends up driving a lot of politics in the 19th century onward. And so he talks a lot about imagined communities and discourse communities, and I thought that that might be a helpful way to think about evangelicals, rather than just saying evangelicals believe a couple of things and let's just talk about the theology, that we could say evangelicals are engaged in a conversation, and when they engage in that conversation, they then have a common imagination, or they're imagining who else is engaged in that conversation. So it's a community, but not done by. It would be hard to take a census of this community. To back up a little bit, evangelicals are hard to talk about because they don't have any authoritative structure. Right? Like, there is a Catholic Church. You can point to it. There are people in charge. There are written documents. For that matter, there is like a Mary Kay society. There are people in charge. There's a structure. There are documents. Evangelicalism isn't like that, right? Evangelicalism is this kind of amorphous community that has a lot of power, that we talk about a lot, that people have to decide whether they're part of or not. But it's very vague, and just saying, oh, they believe the Bible doesn't get you that far. It specifically doesn't get you that far if you're just trying to understand what specific people are going to do in the world, right? Like, historians' job is to just describe what people have done, but so much of it, you just describe and describe and describe, and then you say, okay, guess what they're going to do next. And we have no idea. And you should have at least a little, like, I should be able to guess, right? Like, more than 50% of the time, at least, you know. And so I was really frustrated with both the political, because there's no infrastructure, like people tend to default to these theological explanations and these political explanations that don't actually get us that far in understanding who's involved, how they actually are pulled into this conversation and pulled into this imaginary community, and then what they might do next. So thinking about it as a conversation helped me, using Habermas, and then thinking about, well, what's the actual material reality? What holds this conversation together? Where is it happening? And bookstores are a pretty good place that this happens. They're not the only one. I think Billy Graham or other famous evangelists have often worked, right? An evangelical, it has been said, is anyone who likes Billy Graham. Since he's died, that's been much harder to use as a thing. But celebrity, conferences, anything that goes in a circuit, magazines. I mean, I think this is part of what we're actively doing at Christianity Today, where I work. It's creating a conversation and a community where people can decide if they're a part. So Habermas helped me shift to thinking about it as an imagined community and a conversation. I don't think Habermas himself knows what an evangelical is or is very interested in that conversation, but his theoretical framework was really helpful.
Awesome. I'm sorry to jump in on like the deep theoretical end.
No, that's good. It's important, but it's also a little tricky.
Yeah, I do have one more kind of theoretical, like background type method question, because early on you talk about one of the reasons you were excited about this project and you wanted to do it is because historians need to account for it, and the word you use is contingencies.
Mm-hmm.
And being someone who dabbles in history, I'm not sure what is meant, and you probably have a specific meaning that you want to communicate. And so I wonder if you could talk about those contingencies a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, it is, so if you take a like intro to history class, they'll talk about, here are the basic things that history is about. Complexity is always one. Continuity is another. Some people do it with 5 C's. And one of those is contingency. But historians actually don't talk about contingency that much. I think it's more important than we've allowed it to be, which is to say that any people that you study, they had choices, there were forks in the road, and they took one fork, but they could have taken the other one. Mm-hmm. And we have to understand not just why they did the thing they did, but how they could have done something different, and why they might do the different thing in the future. So let's just not quite going to name names, but let's give a much more concrete example. You could fill an entire shelf of this library with books that explain how evangelicals became supporters of the religious right or became the religious right. That is an important part of our history. That's an important thing to wrestle with. Almost all of them act like it had to happen that way. Mm-hmm. And I want to say, well, it didn't have to happen that way because it's history. It's a historical movement. Could have gone the other way. It happened to go this way, which means the next fork in the road, it could have gone a different way too. So wrestling with how to describe things in their full contingency, how to account for the history without giving an essentialist reading of the people that you're talking about. They had to do it like this. And one way I do that is by looking at these novels and looking at the variety of responses to them. So when a novel does come up in a history, the normal thing is people will say, this novel is about political anxieties, and it sold 65 million copies. 65 million people had political anxieties. And I don't know about you, but sometimes when I read books, I don't like them. Sometimes when I read books, I don't agree with them. And so I just thought, interpreting all of the readers as if they all agreed with the book and they all went the same way, like it's a really weird flattening of a book. And if we're going to account for a book as a historical object, which is the weird root thing that I'm trying to do in this book, we have to start thinking about audiences, especially mass audiences, as pretty diverse. Once you start doing that, some of the contingencies become a little more clear. Some people loved this idea of being in conflict with their neighbors, and that faith would drive you to a certain kind of political antagonism. But some people hated it. Or some people had complicated feelings. If you do a literary project, you often read a novel and then try and come up with the correct interpretation of that novel. Sometimes what I tell people is that I am also interested in the bad readings of the novel. Everyone who misread Left Behind or misunderstood it, or maybe understood it more correctly than the author, like all of that is also part of the history. And so to me, that makes it really interesting. It also gives me chances I spent a lot of time digging around Goodreads for bad reviews of books, people who didn't like books, and those were some of my favorite parts of the research. The second novel that I talk about is This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti. And I found one of my favorite book reviews ever. and it was just couple of sentences. This woman wrote, "I found this book on a train in Fort Lauderdale," which, first breaking news, there are trains in Fort Lauderdale. I didn't know that. "Found this book on a train in Fort Lauderdale. I wanted to throw myself off." That's it. That's the whole review. 2-sentence, devastating. But she's one of the people that read this book, right? So if we're going to think about the complexity of what it means to be involved in a conversation about a book, what it means to imagine the world in a certain way because you're engaging the book, for at least a moment, that woman tried on the imaginative world of Frank Peretti. But it's suspending disbelief, which is different than believing, so she could put it down or, throw it off the train. Needs to be.
Oh, that's awesome. I think we should probably mention what books you engage in.
Yeah.
Yeah, you Love Comes Softly, which I've never read, and from your description, don't know if I will. Left Behind, which I'm familiar with. Frank Peretti, but before Left Behind in the order. This is terrible of me. Beverly Lewis's first book,
The Shunning.
And then The Shack. And those are the 5 books you engage. And what I appreciate about your engagement with the book is that you not only engage the content and the reviews, but you engage a little bit of the publishing dilemma as well, getting the book to the publisher, and then the publisher deciding whether or not to do this as a thing in American history, right? Like, can you talk a little bit about why you chose this 5, and then related to that, was there one that you wish you included that you didn't? And then on a more lighter side, which of the 5 authors would you go have a beer with?
That's interesting. Yeah, so I originally started researching genres, and I was going to have a chapter per genre. And then I read 30 romance novels and thought, no, that's not the way to do it. I also had a long argument with a friend who's was an English professor about defining genres, and then decided that was a really boring question that wasn't going to help me at all, and I never wanted to have that argument again. So that was the bend into that first approach. So each of the 5 books my book stretches from the 1950s to the early 2000s, and a little bit up to the present, but really the early 2000s. And the novels go from the late 80s to 2008, when The Shack becomes a surprise bestseller. Each of the books sold more than 1 million copies and marked a change in the way that Christian books are sold. So I was looking for something that kind of flagged a transition. Sometimes the book themselves drives the transition, and sometimes they're just like the lucky beneficiaries of the transition. But it marks a change in the market, which allows me to track the sort of narrative arc of the market changing. I don't remember if there was a third. Yeah, so it's a change in the market, and each one sold more than 1 million copies. The books are really different, so part of the trick of writing my book was making it seem continuous, and that I didn't just cherry pick some books, that these books are worth engaging and worth thinking about. And part of the problem is that the market is a consistent narrative arc, and then each book is like a case study, but also things are totally different now than they were the last time. I suppose the third thing is that each book is also a different style. So I didn't want to just do another romance novel, in part because the themes end up being the same. So the book I probably should have written about, that I would have liked to have written about, is Francine Rivers. Some of her books have just been more widely read and more important to many, many women. And I didn't just because I'd already written about Love Comes Softly, which is the book in 1986 that convinces evangelical publishers that there's a market for Christian fiction, and that really they should be aiming most of their marketing not at pastors, which they had been doing, but at middle-aged women, mothers in the suburbs who do most of the buying in America, certainly most of the buying of books. And that was the really interesting and important religious market versus pastors who have a seminary library and aren't interested in romance novels typically. So because I'd already written so much about Beverly Lewis and Jeanette Oak and Love Comes Softly, I didn't feel like I could do Francine Rivers. It felt a little bit like it would be repetitious, though Francine Rivers is a better writer. And Francine Rivers also was a secular romance novelist who had a conversion experience, who then wrote scriptural Bible-themed romance novels, taking her plot from the book of Amos to tell the story that she wanted to tell. So that's really interesting. And comparing the pre-Christian and post-Christian romance novels would have been really interesting if I had time to do another project, or someone else wants to do another project that recommends that. Have a beer with. Frank Peretti seems like a really nice guy. I don't know if he drinks beer. He's also a really good storyteller. Like, if you ever watch him talk, like, he's really entertaining. I think he'd probably be my choice. He's also he's a Pentecostal from the Northwest who got sick of church and started writing novels, and that's as close to my people as you can possibly get. I just feel very at home. Like, he plays the banjo in his spare time. It's a very, when you see him talk, I'm like, I know you. So, yeah, but I don't know if he drinks beer. And I don't know, after writing this book, if he wants to hang out with me, which that was not, the purpose of the book.
Yeah. I appreciate that in your book you offer I'm trying to find the right word. I wrote sympathetic, and that might be what I go with. A sympathetic account of American evangelicalism. Empathetic. Yeah. One in which you don't immediately come out and say, here's everything that's wrong with them, which is a helpful corrective for at least me. And you try to center it on the question they're answering, since Jesus died for me, how does that impact I think your words are, a normal Tuesday? And could you describe how you came to that realization, how you why you decided to angle the book that way.
Yeah. I think among American historians you have kind of two, not really schools, but styles. One is, now I'm really going to criticize them, right? There's a, like, now that I have all of the knowledge and authority, like I can tell you the truth and be extra fierce. And the other is, I would say, like the empathetic school or the empathetic approach, which is, I want you to come away still disagreeing with whatever decision these people made that you wouldn't have made, but actually deeply understanding why they felt the way they did. I think that approach has always attracted me. I'm really interested in that anyway. It does mean, I think it works better with some groups than others, right? Like if you write about the Ku Klux Klan and people come away just going, oh, now I get it, right? Like maybe there's some moral questions there. Like maybe that's not the move you want to make. But I'm actually willing to make an argument that it is a good historical move. It's just that it like comes with some different risks in different spaces. But yeah, it's not to say I'm not going to criticize, but I really felt like I wasn't doing a service to my reader if I wasn't helping them deeply understand all of these characters, all of these people, and in their contingency and in their choices. And I did find, the more I researched, that the core of each novel is this question about belief. It's not like there's a rule with evangelical fiction that it has to be this way, but the core of each novel is this question of, how do I live out my faith in this world? And what's interesting is they give very different answers, and you would think that evangelicalism would kind of have to give the same answer, and it turns out there's a bunch of different answers to that question, and some of them go together, and some of them are compatible, and some of them aren't, some of them are not, and some of them could be but actually aren't. But I think that's, as I say towards the end, I personally am also invested in that question, and if I don't like people's answers, Jesus died and rose again, what are you going to do on a Tuesday? I still think the question's important, and I still felt there were reasons to respect and take seriously the answers that they gave, even if they weren't my answers, or even if I hope they're not your answers. Yeah.
A little rapture theology quiz.
Okay. Everyone's favorite part.
Yeah.
If half of you would just like disappear right now, that
That
would
would
be
be amazing.
well timed.
Yeah. But really, actually, it's only one question. It's been
Okay.
burning in my mind. I wrote it in the margins of my book.
Great.
Why are people raptured naked?
That's a good question. Someone brought this up yesterday as how awkward that makes the family dynamics if you're raptured together. Actually, so the simple reason is just that you don't have human-made stuff in heaven, right? That's all. You just don't. There's no, it just becomes a really weird version of heaven. It's like, oh man, this one guy had a pocket watch. Like, it's just a very strange, like, no, there's not human-made stuff in heaven. The more interesting thing in Left Behind is that they don't just leave their clothes behind, their clothes are neatly folded. Like, I would imagine you just have like a pile of clothes all over the place, but no, like apparently the Holy Spirit folds all the clothes. Like, they're not folding them. Yeah. That I don't think there's a theological explanation for. I think he just decided the rapture wouldn't be messy. There's other stuff, like the plane crashes, but the clothes are folded. I think like the Holy Spirit could also land the plane for people. I don't know. Yeah, it's wild.
Which of the 5 books did you enjoy the most when you had to read it? Or did you read any before you started the academic process?
They're not for me, I'm not their intended audience. and I really, in the process of reading them, I kind of ended up thinking that most evaluations of books as good and bad are just about preference, or sometimes class, or sometimes taste. I ended up thinking that we often end up making these as kind of moral arguments for good literature and bad literature. And I became deeply suspect of those moral arguments. Most criticism of romance novel is just people deciding that women are stupid, and it ends up being deeply offensive to me. Even though I don't read romance novels, they're not the thing I enjoy. And I really wanted my book to be interesting and engaging to people who hate Christian fiction and think it's bad, and people who really love it and think it's interesting. But let me just say, if you think you don't like Christian fiction, and if you have any experience of evangelicalism and you're like, not interested, don't like it, I only even went to that talk because Beth told me to, that's fine. The book I would recommend, though, is Frank Peretti's The Visitation. Frank Peretti's The Visitation is his, it's like his third or fourth novel. It's his most autobiographical. It's about a pastor who's sick of church. He quits. He's done with church. He spends long, very accurate descriptions of how stupid church meetings can be, and how frustrated he is at silly stuff. Like, turn to your neighbor and say, he hates that. He talks about how much he hates that. It's a Christian who's done. That's the starting place. The end is a small town parade with 3 Jesuses who claim to be Jesus, and people think they're Jesus, and they're fist fighting in the center of town. If that doesn't grab you, like, I don't understand, like, come on, that's an amazing story. So just, yeah, that would be my pitch. If you don't like this stuff, but you think maybe I should give it a try, pick up The Visitation. You can still find it around. It's like 10 cents on Amazon. You can afford it.
Projecting to the future a little bit,
Yeah.
how will evangelical publishing continue? Is it going to continue as such a strong culture-making institution, or is it going to wane as, self-publishing just becomes more and more popular? Are these publishers going to remain kind of the culture makers?
I mean, the thing that's happening right now is just a fragmentation of the market. And some of this is just the disappearance of the Christian bookstore. Some of it is the effect of the other things that are happening within evangelicalism, the other sort of crack-ups that are happening. If you think of something like Frank Peretti, though, in 1986, if you wanted to buy Frank Peretti, the only place to go was a Christian bookstore. And if you liked it or thought it was interesting, it was next to all of these other books. And that made you think, oh, maybe there's like something in common with these other books, and maybe I am somehow in common with the readers of these other books. There's a sense of a space in a community. Frank Peretti still sells. This Present Darkness, which came out in 1986, sells 8,000 new copies a year. That's not people who buy it on Amazon. That's people who want the clean, fresh-cut stuff. That's a lot of books. But where are those people buying it? Mostly on Amazon. When you go on Amazon, it sells you Frank Peretti. It doesn't put you next to a Christian romance novel or even Left Behind or The Shack. It says, if you like this book, you might also like other Christian horror, right? Or just Frank Peretti. You're not an evangelical anymore, you're a Frank Peretti fan. So the publishing industry will still continue. What's dissipated is the sense of community and common identity and conversation between the books that was created by the market as the way we sell books becomes more and more niche and more into channels. One effect you see of that a lot is it's really hard for an author to get published if they don't have a platform. So you'll see increasingly, we're already seeing it, increasingly new authors are already known in some way, right? You had to establish yourself as something. Frank Peretti was working in a ski factory. No one knew who he was.
Other than your own, what's
Yeah.
the most important book on American evangelicalism?
Oh, American evangelicalism. There's a ton, but the one that I would really recommend is Molly Worthen, Apostles of Reason. That is such a good book, really, really good book. She specifically looks at evangelicals building institutions and attempting to establish respectability. So it's evangelicals building colleges, building the National Association of Evangelicals, founding Christianity Today, and that's the activity that she's interested in particular. There are many other good books. I'm sure most people here know, but Kristen Dumais' Jesus and John Wayne is very good, and Kristen is a friend of mine. And I would also recommend Matthew Avery Sutton's American Apocalypse, which looks at apocalypticism in America as a sort of uniting theological innovation that brought a bunch of people together. So, U.S. for one. There are three, but you can start with Molly Worthen.
Wonderful.
She's great.
Book recommendations are the name of the game. I have some more questions, but let's open it up. I don't know what time it is, so
4:10.
4:10. Good time to open it up for
That sounds great.
the people here, and then I can pull it back in with some more questions.
Thoughts, questions?
So what would you want us to know based on what you did? What would you want us to know about American evangelicalism? I mean, I know you're moving away from and here are the propositions, but what is that? What are the things in the center that hold the conversation together?
Yeah, I think
The question is, what are the things that hold American evangelicalism together? I'm just repeating for the microphone. Yeah, sorry. I just remembered in the middle of
Thanks. Part of the intervention I'm trying to make is where we look for the answer to that question. I want to shift our attention from what evangelicals believe and how they vote to what are the structures that hold the community together? What are the structures that allow for a conversation? Because conversations can change, which goes back to the contingency. So how do I think about conferences, book markets, sometimes the real tangible stuff of the structure? Yeah. And maybe the second thing I would say is that the movement that is evangelicalism is a bunch of different things all at once. And if you want to understand it and you want to know if someone else understands it, that's are they representing it as a bunch of things at the same time? In the way that a conversation is a bunch of things at the same time? Or it's just a clean, clear ideology that shoots through and takes no prisoners? Yeah.
How do you see, because you talked about how kind of looking at books in a bookstore, you see what's around it and how changing algorithms with buying books on Amazon shifts things. How do you see evangelical influencers on social media shaping evangelical identity? Because the Twitter algorithm, if you like something from one person that someone retweeted, that's going to come back up in your feed and be suggested to you. And people that you follow, people they follow, or that follow them get popped up and you decide all those things. How do you see that dynamic shifting evangelical identity now?
So the question, while you think of
Yeah,
answering it,
go ahead.
how do you see evangelical identity being changed and shifted through influencers and social media?
The mechanisms that you're describing, I think that's exactly right. The big change is that there's lots and lots of circles as opposed to a few that kind of seem close to the same. So I think if you like got dropped into 1950s America, evangelicalism would only have a couple of influencers or a couple of like circles of conversations, and they would kind of all seem like they were the same. There were some important differences, but you could go, well, almost. Where now you can see people talking to each other all the time, and you can see who responds to each other, and you can see who blocks each other, and trying to turn that into a single coherent thing is actually pretty hard to do, right? And you can't have evangelicalism 1 through 47, but I think that's what we actually have, right? It is a broad movement that has lots of different pieces that don't hang together currently. The other problem with something like Twitter, though, is that most people aren't on it. So you also have to remember that it's like not real. But it is, but it's not. Other questions, thoughts?
I'm still a little perplexed on the role of the bookstore. Just don't know enough of the evangelical
Sure.
world. Why is that
What was the role of the
physical
bookstore?
space so significant?
Yeah. So, let me back up and tell a little bit of the story of religious publishing in America. From the time books are published in America, mainstream publishers don't really publish religious books. They kind of can't. There's not a market, which is odd because Americans are pretty religious and they read religious books, but there's too much variety for there to be any clear like title that like, oh, people will buy this. I think the first religious imprint, for example, the first like branch of a publisher, of a mainstream publisher that publishes religious books is in the like 1950s. It's like Harper One becomes, and they publish this sort of, it's like halfway between Oprah and New Age, basically. But before that, nothing. So all religious books are published by denominations. So you've got Methodist books and you've got Mennonite books. And the distribution network of the books maps on exactly to the shape of the denomination. Does the denomination have a conference? Then that's where books are sold. Does it have a seminary? Then that's where authors are recruited and where books are sold. Does the seminary have a list of the names of everyone who graduated? That's your mailing list. Which means that Methodists and Mennonites, just to take the M's from the list, never talk about if they have anything in common. They never, they're not in a conversation together. Starting in the post-war period, this starts to shift. And a number of publishers, specifically Dutch Reformed publishers in Grand Rapids, start to think, man, I bet we could sell some books across these denominational lines if we could just figure it out, if we could just sort of reach people. So there are some conferences that they set up, like bookshops, one in Winona Lake, Indiana, which is a conference center. And the Methodists and the Mennonites would not go at the same time, but they would both use the same space, which was famous because of Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday had lived there. So they thought, what if we sell books and this week we're selling to Baptists, next week we're selling to Methodists, next week we're selling to Nazarenes, but we'll see if there's a common stuff that they're all interested in and that they can all talk about. Then the Christian Books Sellers Association forms the CBA in the 1950s and kind of institutionalizes this idea that there is a common Protestant imagination or conversation that they're both like tapping into, but also creating. This then supports a lot of bookstores, and by the 1970s, religious publishing is one of the major genres of books that are being published. They're not being published by any of the main publishers, and they're not being sold at any of the main bookstores. They're all being sold through family bookstores in the suburbs, run by mom and pop, with this new wave of credit that's just happened. At that moment, evangelicalism is real. That's when evangelicalism is this common sense, this common sensibility, and this common conversation. So you still exist, just like I did before I walked into the bookstore. You still exist in your particular church, and you say, I'm Pentecostal. I'm actually only this type of Pentecostal. I don't know about those other Pentecostals. And then you walk into the church and you're like, oh, well, or you walk into the bookstore and you're like, oh, my Pentecostalism fits into this space. It fits into this world. And so just as evangelicalism never has a council or a synod or any kind of formal structure, it's created through that book selling structure, that idea and that sense of community. That's why it matters.
This form of editor bishops, as it were.
Yeah. Newspapers did this in an earlier period. Hymnals did it. There's a bunch of different ways. You also see, interestingly, you see a shift that has to happen once you jump from a denominational publisher to this trans-denominational publisher. You stop publishing books on things that divide your audience, like baptism. And instead you start publishing books on things that they all have in common, like families. So why does family values become so important to evangelicals in the 1980s? Well, one reason is they all have families. They all read the Bible. So a book that says, what does the Bible say about families, suddenly applies to everyone. Where maybe if you're just a Methodist publisher, they all have families. And like, maybe, but you're also not in the suburbs, so it's more intergenerational. But you also are going to spend more time on your Methodist distinctives than on these common trans-denominational things. So that's the kind of explanation that we can do about evangelicals by paying attention to bookstores and book markets more broadly, that we can't do if we just say, what did famous pastors say in this time period?
Well, allow me to expand maybe beyond
Yeah.
North America and talk about how these books, did you look into how these books were received internationally? Let's say beyond North America, just as international. Because a couple of the authors are Canadian, right? So we don't want to
Yeah.
neglect to note that difference. But
Yeah.
are these books received in the majority world, in Africa and in South America?
I don't know about Africa. There is a small industry of translating them into Spanish. You can find them in Latin America, and there is a small industry of translating them into European languages. The only place I found where they're huge is actually the Netherlands. Every once in a while...
Dutch Reform, man.
Yeah, it is that Dutch Reformed thing, and there's a certain type of evangelical subculture in the Netherlands that responds to these a little bit more. Every once in a while, a Christian fiction author will actually go on a tour in the Netherlands, which is amazing. But yeah, they're relatively small. I think they tend to read as very American in other spaces. When I lived in Germany, the Shack was all sorts of places. You could buy it in the Christian bookstore in the town that I was in. I'm told the translation wasn't very good. I didn't try and read it in German. Yeah, they don't translate super well. When they do, it turns out to be really interesting. Side note, one of the theoretical books that was really helpful for me for thinking about audiences was actually about the soap opera Dallas, called Watching Dallas. And it's by this scholar from the Netherlands who found out that when Dallas, the soap opera, was on, 50% of all people in the Netherlands watched it. And every cultural explanation for why is Dallas important, why do so many people watch Dallas, how should we interpret Dallas, they're all about American culture. And she's like, so why do Dutch people love Dallas? What is going on? And it's a really fascinating book and really taught me a lot about how to do cultural analysis of mass media. So, yeah, go read Watching Dallas if you want to do that. It's a wild and strange little book.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, this stuff doesn't go too far abroad. There are other networks that work in those spaces, and they tend to be more defined by the other religious institutions, right? So if you're evangelical in the Netherlands, it's partly because of your response to the historic state church. And so it doesn't hang together quite in the same way that it does in the U.S., where we have disestablishment.
One of your kind of concluding points in the book is all the novels highlight a certain form of individualism.
Mm-hmm.
And I think we've seen kind of culturally currently, we've seen how that's a poignant issue. What about what do these novels teach about individualism? And just talk about that a little bit for us.
Yeah, some of them are more individualistic than others. I think the romance novel at the start, Love Comes Softly, is the one that I really think of as exemplifying a kind of individualism. And it does that by sort of asking, the question it asks is, what is belief like? And the answer it suggests is, it's like trusting that someone has the best intentions for you. It's like falling in love, and it's like specifically this kind of trust that God wants the best for you. And if you can trust, you'll have abundant life. So the author brings in what's called Keswick theology or higher life theology, and it really tells the story of there's still suffering, there's still trouble, but it's embedded in this trust that you will flourish. And the more you look at it, though, the more that flourishing turns out to be really individualistic. There's no part of the story where my flourishing requires my neighbor's flourishing, or what's good, I can only be free if my neighbor is also free, or something like that. It's not that it couldn't be told that way. It's not like the theology couldn't also have that sort of corporate flourishing commitment. But as a matter of fact, it didn't. It just ended up being really focused on the individual and the family and kind of in the domestic space without any neighbors necessarily. The question, should I love my neighbor or who is my neighbor, kind of doesn't come up, right? Which seems like an important question.
Yeah, so just staying on that line of thought, so my growing up with evangelicals, whenever I encountered them was, have you accepted Jesus as your Lord and personal Savior?
Yeah.
And how much does that impact, that individualism, just their disinterest in the social gospel,
Mm-hmm.
or, kind of distancing from it in some ways. But, how much of that is an impact? And you said something else earlier. It was something to the effect, evangelicals were asking how to live out faith in the world. didn't they read the gospel? I mean,
Yeah.
I mean, where's Jesus? Jesus is kind of living it out in the world, is he not? I mean, how does that? I'm kind of curious. The question. How does that kind of play out?
Yeah, so there's an earlier Christian novel that has everyone ask the question, what would Jesus do?
Yeah, sure.
Which is a bracelet you can buy while you're buying any of these
yeah.
books.
Of course. Check out.
But, like, let's be fair. What Jesus did was cast out demons, heal the sick, proclaim the kingdom of God as present, die and rise again. Like, I gotta get groceries. Like, I certainly, I'm certainly not gonna walk to Jerusalem. So the application of I should be like Jesus turns out to be a pretty complicated day-to-day struggle. So it's not that they hadn't read that, it's that there's a bunch of answers to that, and that's the conversation that they're having. I think that's the conversation they're having throughout these books. And they are open to there being some different answers. So Love Comes Softly says, don't worry about out there. Just take care of your immediate space, trust God. When hard stuff happens to you, trust God, so on. But then in the very next book that sort of changes Christian fiction is Frank Peretti. And Peretti says, just to put them in conversation, Peretti says, man, all of this Christian fiction tells me that if I trust God and read the Bible and have faith, that my life will go really well. And my life sucks. I'm really struggling. My church I burnt out. I left my church. Now I work in a ski factory. Does that mean I'm not following Jesus? Does that mean I don't have faith? What am I supposed to do with that? So he tells a story where what faith means on a Tuesday is a kind of a struggle. It's conflict. And he imagines certain types of conflict, and how would trying to follow Jesus put me in conflict with the school board, for example. That's a really different answer than the flourishing answer. But what I'm trying to show is that they're part of the same conversation. It does happen in both these cases to be individualistic, though Peretti is super concerned about the city and the shape of the city and has all these epistemological questions that are super interesting. So it's not quite individualistic in the same way, which is part of it's a bunch of different things I'm trying to describe.
I was just thinking about other Christian fiction. So there's the Chronicles of Narnia.
Sure.
Frederick Buechner has several novels. Will Campbell, Divine River. How is it they fell outside of evangelicalism, or is the scope of your book have more to do with evangelical publishing houses?
Yeah. Sometimes so the question is about other fiction, Christian fiction, whether it counts, basically, whether it's part of this conversation. I wanted books that were produced, distributed, and consumed within a sort of evangelical ecosystem. If I'd taken something like Pilgrim's Progress, I now have to explain England at the time that John Bunyan is writing, and it just starts stretching out in a bunch of different ways. But some of those books are being distributed and sold in the space, right? So C.S. Lewis is really interesting. There's a bunch of ways he's not an evangelical, and then he becomes an evangelical through being distributed in this space and consumed in this space and put in this conversation with people. And then others, it's thematically they're deeply connected, but because they're not part of the same conversation, they have somehow met a gatekeeper, or they didn't want to be a part of that conversation. So it's not just that some publishers make you evangelical, it's some publishers get you into the stream of the conversation that's happening here. The example that I point to most often, a lot of people want to just say an evangelical book is a book written by an evangelical, in which case John Grisham is the best best-selling evangelical writer. But he's having a different conversation, right? And he's existing in a different sort of book market, and the lines of those book markets turn out to matter. The community created by those book markets turn out to matter. Not just, and this is where I'm undercutting a little bit some evangelical beliefs and some evangelical anthropology. It's not just what the author believes in his heart. It's also who his community is and what kind of conversation she's having.
Or market.
Or market. Yeah, because of the market. You can only have a conversation because of physical spaces. Evangelicalism is only real when people are connected, and they're connected through actual material reality.
Well, everyone, let's thank Daniel for his
Thanks
time
for
with
coming,
us.
guys. I appreciate it.
Again, his book is Reading Evangelicals: How Christian Fiction Shaped a Culture and a Faith. Buy it. You can buy it from him. You can buy it from Amazon. Read it. It's great.